The numbers are staggering. But the facts are, well, they're even more unsettling. We are tracking a multi-billion-dollar fraud scheme money stolen from American taxpayers, meant to feed children, stabilize housing, and, care for the medically vulnerable.
And the federal response has been just as big.
Unprecedented.
Yeah.
We're talking over 100 federal officers and armored vehicles deployed in Minneapolis-St. Paul, targeting the largest Somali community in the U.S.
But that's not even the whole story, is it?
Not even close. At the same time, 1,000 miles away, an elected Somali official is arrested on felony gun charges. He's caught in a residency scandal that's linked not just to a condemned property, but to a major federal drug house raid.
And then there's the terrorism angle, which is maybe the most shocking part.
The most shocking allegation: that a portion of the stolen welfare money may have flowed directly to al-Shabaab, an al-Qaeda-linked terror group. So are these two geographically distinct incidents, this massive financial crime and this high-level political corruption, are they just isolated events? Or are they chapters of a single deeper story about the collision of cultures and a fundamental breakdown of public trust?
That's the question we have to get into.
We are going to uncover the full story. Stay with us as we break this down in our in-depth discussion right here on The Deep Dive. And if you find our reporting valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to support our channel. We truly appreciate it. So, we have a critical mission today. We have to synthesize these two really complex and geographically separate stories. The fraud crackdown in the Twin Cities and then this political scandal in Maine, to see the patterns, the systemic failures that the evidence suggests.
Right.
This isn't just a crime story. It feels like a story about institutional betrayal on a massive scale.
It is, and the scope of what's being alleged in both places makes this so much more than just, typical white-collar crime. We're looking at what federal prosecutors are calling a deeply entrenched criminal network.
A network, not just a few bad actors.
Exactly. One that has allegedly siphoned billions of dollars out of public programs. And when you combine that with direct challenges to the integrity of local political office, and then you add in these serious questions of national security, the need for this deep dive becomes crystal clear.
Right.
The scale of it all is what really demands a thorough analysis of how this kind of exploitation was allowed to grow seemingly unchecked for so long.
Okay, so let's start with the scene in the Twin Cities, because the way it's described is decisive and overwhelming. This was an enforcement action ordered directly by the Trump administration. And this wasn't some quiet, multi-year paper audit. This was a surge. We're talking about the deployment of over 100 federal officers hitting Minneapolis and St. Paul with armored vehicles, targeted raids. The visual message was just absolutely stark.
And that deployment was completely by design. It was meant to signal a profound shift in federal priorities. For years, there had been this perception, and we see this in the reporting, that federal agencies were maybe a little reluctant to pursue large-scale fraud within this specific community.
Why? Political sensitivities?
That's the suggestion. But this move, this massive force, the largest enforcement action against the Somali community in U.S. history, it sent a clear, undeniable message. It was basically saying, and this is a quote, "Years of looking the other way are officially over."
So they were going after what they believed was a deeply entrenched criminal infrastructure.
That's exactly right.
And the geography here is so important to understanding the size of this operation. Minneapolis and St. Paul, they host the largest Somali community in the entire United States.
It's about 84,000 people.
84,000. And most arrived as refugees starting in the 1990s, fleeing that devastating civil war. So why does the concentration of the community matter so much to this story of fraud?
Well, it really comes down to the concept of critical mass and organization. When you have a diaspora community that's this large and this concentrated, it can allegedly sustain a very sophisticated internal network of operations.
So it operates kind of outside the purview of the wider community.
Precisely. The size of the community seems to have allowed the alleged perpetrators to create a web of hundreds of interconnected organizations, many of them just shell companies, which you absolutely need to execute fraud on this breathtaking scale.
So this wasn't just disorganized crime.
Oh, not at all. The allegations are that this was organized crime and that it leveraged existing community and even clan structures to facilitate the movement of money and, the falsification of all these records.
And the sheer magnitude of the theft is what first got everyone's attention.
Yeah.
The initial spark was that staggering number, $250 million.
Yeah.
Allegedly stolen from the federal child nutrition programs. These are funds meant to reimburse sites that are supposed to be providing meals to vulnerable children. But, as you said, the reporting reveals this was just the tip of the iceberg.
Absolutely. The investigation into the nutrition scheme, it basically just cracked open the door to reveal something far, far larger. To even understand the mechanism of that first fraud, you have to look at the paperwork.
All right.
The whole alleged scheme relied on fraudulent headcounts. So you'd have these companies, often set up as nonprofits or, say, cultural centers. They would claim they were feeding tens of thousands of children every single day.
Tens of thousands.
Oh, yeah. One site might claim it served 5,000 meals a day, 7 days a week, and demand massive reimbursement from the government, when in reality, they were serving maybe a fraction of that, or in some cases, it was a completely sham site. They weren't serving anyone.
That alone sounds like a pretty sophisticated operation, just to manage the documentation and the fake logistics for one program.
It was. And the reporting highlights that this network didn't just limit itself to one program. Once the authorities realized the depth of the organization, they uncovered an entire network of fraudulent activities spanning multiple federal aid programs.
And that's where the complexity just explodes.
It really does.
So what were the other major schemes they uncovered that took this from millions into the billions?
So beyond the nutrition programs, two other huge areas of alleged fraud were identified: housing stabilization fraud and autism services fraud. If you really want to understand how vulnerable the system was, you have to look at how these schemes were monetized.
Okay, let's unpack those. Start with housing stabilization. What was the mechanism there?
The housing stabilization programs were federal relief funds meant to help people avoid eviction or keep their homes stabilized during economic crises.
Right, so rental assistance, utility payments, that kind of thing.
Exactly, and the alleged mechanism here was very similar to the nutrition program. They'd create shell companies, usually fake property management companies or, fake landlords. Then they'd submit falsified lease agreements or applications for rental arrears on behalf of tenants who didn't exist, or for properties they didn't actually manage.
So they were creating a paper trail for a crisis that wasn't real.
That's a perfect way to put it. They'd create a paper trail proving an individual was desperate for housing help, they'd receive the government funds, and then they'd just siphon that money through their shell corporations. They never actually assisted a legitimate tenant.
So they're essentially creating a ghost crisis of housing need and then positioning themselves as the ghost intermediary to collect the money.
Precisely. They were exploiting the speed and the necessity of aid disbursement. When governments rush to stabilize a housing crisis, the guardrails, as they're often called, are sometimes looser. The system relies heavily on trust and certification.
Which created a massive vulnerability.
A massive vulnerability for coordinated exploitation.
And then there's the other part, which is just truly disturbing. The autism services fraud. How does a group of alleged fraudsters manage to steal money that's meant for medically fragile individuals?
This one is, I think, particularly egregious. The autism services fraud allegedly targeted specialized healthcare funding, which is extremely expensive and, highly regulated.
Right.
This required setting up fake or heavily inflated service centers, often disguised as behavioral clinics or specialized care facilities. And the reporting suggests the fraud involved falsifying patient records, billing Medicaid or other programs for millions of dollars of specialized high-intensity services.
What kind of services?
Things like therapy sessions, behavioral interventions, services that were never actually provided to the autistic patients, or in other cases, the patient count was just grossly inflated.
That requires a level of internal knowledge about medical billing, about regulatory compliance, that suggests, a pretty significant level of sophistication.
Absolutely. It shows a capacity to penetrate and exploit three fundamentally different sectors of the welfare state: food aid, housing, and specialized medical services.
All at the same time?
All at the same time. So when you combine all these interconnected operations, the child nutrition, the housing stabilization, the autism services, plus other smaller schemes, the collective estimated loss, according to federal prosecutors, runs into the billions of dollars.
Billions. With a B.
With a B. And that figure is why authorities felt they weren't just facing individual criminals, but a deeply embedded infrastructure.
It really just redefines the whole concept of organized crime within a domestic welfare context.
Mm-hmm.
And this massive theft has led federal prosecutors to officially label Minnesota a hub of fraudulent money laundering activity.
And that new designation is deeply significant. It implies that the Twin Cities weren't just the place where the theft happened, they were the logistical center for washing and dispersing all that dirty dirty money.
Which is what leads us to the national security part of all this.
Exactly. The money laundering effort is what brings us to the national security component of this entire narrative.
So let's detail that dimension. The reporting highlights the claim that some of this stolen welfare money may have ended up in the hands of al-Shabaab,
The al-Qaeda-linked terror group in Somalia.
and this just takes the crime from financial exploitation to potential terrorism financing.
The connection, if it's proven, is transformative. Al-Shabaab, for our listeners who might not know, is a sophisticated, deadly militant group. It controls large swaths of territory in Somalia and actively carries out terror attacks.
And they need money to do that.
They require constant large-scale financing to operate. So the reporting suggests that the network of these sham companies and money laundering operations in Minnesota served not only to enrich the perpetrators, but also to facilitate an ancient informal banking system. It's known as hawala.
Hawala. How does that work?
It's commonly used to move money across international borders rapidly and, crucially, untraceably. It's precisely the mechanism that's favored by terrorist organizations.
So the money isn't just being wired from a U.S. bank to a Somali bank.
Not at all. It's being converted into assets, replaced into these informal systems that completely bypass international banking scrutiny.
So when you have billions moving through sham companies and then funneled through these informal channels back toward East Africa, it raises the immediate and frankly profound question.
Was U.S. taxpayer money intended for the most vulnerable people in Minnesota? Was it effectively subsidizing an al-Qaeda affiliate's operations abroad?
That implication alone, that American funds could be financing terror, that has to be the primary reason the federal government shifted from a slow investigation to this massive, highly visible enforcement surge we saw.
Without a doubt, it signaled that this wasn't just a state problem anymore. It was a national security emergency that required the highest level of intervention.
So in the Twin Cities, the picture is clear. Unprecedented federal force deployed against a vast, alleged criminal organization tied to billions in welfare fraud, with potential links to international terror funding.
A huge story on its own.
A huge story. But now we have to transition to the parallel story playing out 1,000 miles to the east.
Which is so necessary because it shifts the focus from purely financial crime to systemic political corruption. It raises questions about integrity right at the local governance level.
Our focus now moves eastward to Lewiston, Maine, where we find the case of Eamon Osman, a Somali city councilor. And this narrative gives us a crucial parallel, looking at alleged political corruption and systemic deception within a local government context.
Right.
And the reporting really emphasizes the stunning synchronicity of these events.
The timing is what makes this just so compelling. So Eamon Osman, the counselor in Lewiston, he was indicted on Monday, December 2nd, facing 2 felony counts.
Related to stealing firearms.
Allegedly stealing firearms, yes. And that exact same day, the Trump administration began deploying that massive surge of federal officers and ICE agents to Minneapolis-St. Paul. And the analysis we've seen argues very strongly that these simultaneous back-to-back incidents are not coincidences. They're seen as reflective of a deeper pattern of accountability issues that are manifesting across the U.S. diaspora.
The felony firearm charges themselves, allegedly stealing guns, that's serious enough to end a political career right there.
Absolutely.
But the reporting reveals that the issues surrounding Osman began well before his arrest. It all centered on this highly unusual residency scandal. He was scheduled to be sworn into office in January, but his legitimate address became the core issue.
And the specifics of this residency scandal are almost unbelievable for an elected official in, a Western democracy. Osman was facing intense scrutiny for claiming residency at an address that had been officially condemned by the city of Lewiston.
Condemned. Let's unpack what that means, because that's a strong word.
It is. A condemned property isn't just one that needs a few repairs. It means the building has been deemed unsafe, uninhabitable, or structurally unsound by the city's code enforcement.
So to claim you live there.
To claim residency in a place like that, or even just maintain it, it suggests a fundamental disregard for municipal law and public safety regulations.
And then the situation got even more serious. The reporting says this condemned address had a much darker connection.
That's where it really escalated.
It was allegedly tied to a federal drug raid that had seized an astronomical quantity of contraband.
That is the pivotal detail. The reports connect this condemned address to a massive federal law enforcement seizure. And we're talking about a cache of illicit materials, 24 pounds of methamphetamine, significant amounts of cocaine and fentanyl, and numerous illegal firearms.
24 pounds of meth.
24 pounds. So the implication is just staggering. You have an individual who is preparing to hold elected office, and he's allegedly connected to a condemned property that was, at the same time, operating as a nexus for major federal drug and weapons trafficking.
This moves so far beyond a simple question of, where someone sleeps at night.
Oh, completely.
It raises immediate and critical questions about integrity, about judgment, and about alleged association with serious organized criminal activity. If an official's claimed residence is linked to 24 pounds of meth, that just challenges the core principles of public trust.
It does. And the analysis we've seen characterizes this behavior as being pulled straight from a third world playbook.
What do they mean by that phrase?
Well, that term, as it's used in the analysis, it refers to a political environment where laws and regulations like residency requirements or property safety codes are just seen as obstacles to be skirted through deception or, outright corruption.
So they're not rules that have to be followed.
Exactly. They're not seen as rules that public servants must rigorously adhere to. So the suggestion is that the integrity of the Lewiston local government was being fundamentally challenged by this really bizarre situation.
And the defense that Osmond's legal counsel offered when the city clerk demanded proof of residency, that only seemed to compound the allegations of deception.
It really did.
The lawyer claimed Osmond couldn't disclose his current address because his life was in danger, and he was allegedly receiving death threats.
Which is the textbook definition of evasion,
Yeah.
but using a highly charged, sympathetic defense. Claiming death threats should immediately trigger a police response, a full investigation, some kind of protection.
So what happened when reporters looked into it?
Well, the reporting says they did their due diligence. They checked with the Lewiston Police Department, and they found, and this is a quote, absolutely no record whatsoever of any police report filed about any threats.
None. Zero. That is a critical rebuttal.
It is.
It implies that the claim of threats and danger wasn't based in reality, but was a manufactured defense. A story designed to provide an excuse for avoiding the mandatory verification of a legitimate address.
A verification required for public office.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when you look at the parallel narratives, the analysis is synthesizing this as a recurring pattern of alleged criminal behavior and evasion.
So in Minnesota,
the pattern is systemic financial exploitation facilitated by deception. And in Maine,
the pattern is systemic political deception, felony charges, and alleged association with severe criminal activity to facilitate holding local power.
And the political implication in Maine is significant because of the shifting demographics there. The reporting notes that Somali communities in cities like Lewiston and Portland have grown rapidly.
They now make up around 15% of some local populations.
And they're actively winning elections, serving on crucial bodies like school boards.
This growth is what makes the integrity of figures like Osmond so paramount. When a prominent elected official from this community is arrested on felony gun charges associated with a condemned drug house and then allegedly fabricates threats to hide their residence, it creates a massive credibility crisis.
A crisis for the entire political structure they're trying to build.
It really does. It challenges the public's fundamental trust. It raises questions about whether the new leadership is adhering to the established rules of governance.
So we have Minnesota showing this alleged systemic financial exploitation of the state treasury.
Right.
In Maine, showing the alleged systemic political exploitation of the democratic process. Both, according to the analysis, point to a pattern of profound institutional distrust and exploitation.
Which brings us to the core analysis of this whole deep dive, the attempt by academics and analysts to move beyond the individual criminality and identify the deeper cultural and historical factors that may be driving these alleged systemic patterns across the U.S.
Right, and this section really relies on synthesizing academic claims and these international parallels to try and explain the root of the issue, as it's discussed in the reporting. We have to start with the academic insight, which tries to connect this alleged widespread behavior to Somalia's history of state collapse.
The material is surprisingly direct on this point. It quotes Dr. Ahmed Samatar, who's a Somali-born professor at Macalester College.
And Dr. Samatar's assessment, which appeared in places like the New York Times, is crucial for contextualizing the alleged fraud. He claimed that Somali refugees arriving in the U.S. came from an environment where, and this is a quote, stealing from a dysfunctional and corrupt government was widespread.
And that quotation is really the starting point for what's called the cultural transmission argument.
What does that mean exactly?
It suggests that the systemic, organized fraud we're seeing in the U.S. is not a behavior that was invented in Minnesota. The argument is that it's a continuation of practices that were ingrained in an environment where the state structure had completely collapsed.
So you're saying if the government isn't seen as legitimate.
Imagine a society where the government is not seen as a legitimate trustee of the public good, but as a hostile or predatory or simply non-existent entity. In that context, surviving often means relying entirely on private, informal networks like clan loyalties and taking resources wherever you can find them.
So the state apparatus is viewed as something external, even adversarial, something to be captured or exploited, rather than a system based on mutual trust and fiduciary duty.
Precisely. The analysis posits that this historical distrust and this established pattern of exploiting state institutions have persisted within the diaspora. The cultural transmission argument is that the informal economies and clan networks that ensured survival in Somalia allegedly became the organizational framework for coordinated fraud in the highly accessible Western welfare state.
This analysis is strongly supported by the arguments of Christopher Rufo, who's referenced in the reporting, and he really emphasizes the persistence of these cultural patterns.
Rufo's point is that features like strong clan networks and this reliance on informal, trust-based financial systems, like the Hawala system we mentioned,
Right.
that these traveled with the diaspora. In Somalia, these systems served as replacements for a non-functional state. But in Minnesota, they allegedly manifested as the operational structure for crime. Well, the clan networks provided the necessary organization and the internal trust to manage dozens of sham companies, fake employees, complex money laundering operations, a sophistication that authorities noted was really unusual for standard welfare fraud.
So this ability to organize internally and trust only members of a specific network is key to pulling off billion-dollar frauds while keeping it all under wraps.
Exactly. So instead of dissolving in the face of a legitimate state, those informal networks allegedly became tools for exploiting that legitimate state.
But the claim that this is a cultural pattern is a heavy one. Is there evidence that this behavior is not unique to the U.S.?
There absolutely is, and this is the vital international parallel that reinforces the entire argument. The reporting points to Norway.
Norway, a social democracy with huge welfare programs.
Exactly, and a significant Somali immigrant population. And Norwegian authorities uncovered similar welfare fraud issues involving their Somali immigrant population. It demonstrates a strikingly familiar systemic problem happening across continents.
Can we get specific on the Norwegian data? How extensive was the problem there?
The reports say that by early 2017, Norwegian immigration authorities had a truly staggering 500 fraud cases under active investigation.
500 cases.
500. And crucially, the reporting explicitly states that these cases were, quote, disproportionately involving Somali populations. The alleged fraud involved things like submitting false claims for family reunification aid, fabricating addresses for housing allowances, and manipulating unemployment benefits.
So all schemes that exploit the system's reliance on self-reporting and trust.
The exact same vulnerabilities. The fact that you have these diverse Western nations, each with different welfare systems, different law enforcement approaches, and they're all documenting the same systemic problem with the same demographic, suggests, as the analysts conclude, that the issue isn't some localized bureaucratic flaw unique to Minneapolis.
Right. It reinforces that cultural transmission hypothesis.
It does. It suggests that the challenge is not simply law enforcement's inability to police fraud, but a deep-seated behavioral pattern related to institutional engagement that is proving resilient across geographic borders and different governmental systems.
To really understand the origin of this pattern, though, we have to go back to the original context, Somalia itself. The reporting references a Reuters investigation that documents the persistence of institutional exploitation there.
Right, and the Reuters investigation described welfare and international aid theft as a daily reality in Somalia. It painted a picture of an entire ecosystem built around this misappropriation, and this is essential for the listener to understand. It shows that the environment the refugees left behind was defined by a pervasive, state-sanctioned, and often violent corruption.
An ecosystem suggests that everyone from the top down is involved. Who are the key players in that ecosystem, according to the investigation?
The investigation documented that the misappropriation involved camp owners who steal resources intended for the internally displaced, local officials who demand kickbacks, and even aid workers who facilitate the diversion of goods intended for the most vulnerable.
Ah.
It describes a top-to-bottom culture of institutional corruption where the purpose of public office or aid distribution is not service, but extraction.
So the conclusion drawn by the analysts in the reporting is that when a population moves from an environment where the state is routinely exploited and extraction is the norm, to a Western environment where the state is designed around trust and accessibility.
The pre-existing cultural patterns fueled by clan networks allegedly translate directly into massive financial crime.
That is the core argument. The analyst suggests that addressing the U.S. problems merely through local law enforcement crackdowns or, minor program redesigns is insufficient.
Because the problem is fundamentally systemic and historical, a pattern that travels with the diaspora.
Right. And the reports use that strong, provocative language that, quote, import the third world and you import third world problems.
And that statement is meant to summarize the difficulty Western nations face in integrating populations coming from environments with collapsed or corrupt institutions into high-trust social systems.
This analysis provides the necessary context for what happened next, the political fallout. If the problem is systemic, historical, and international, the political response becomes even more critical. With the fraud schemes totaling billions and the political scandals reaching local governance, the pressure inevitably fell upon the most visible and prominent Somali-American political figure in the country.
Congresswoman Ilhan Omar.
Right. The reports describe a moment where she was directly confronted on live television with the entire spectrum of these scandals and a pervasive fraud that was, quote, ravaging the Somali community in her home district of Minnesota.
And this televised confrontation on CNN was so significant because it forced a federal representative, a symbolic leader of that diaspora community, to publicly address the allegations of systemic criminality.
She was asked a very pointed, blunt question.
It was essentially, can you shed any light on why the fraud got so out of control in Minnesota? The entire discussion was focused on the fact that her constituents were at the center of what federal prosecutors were calling one of the worst welfare frauds in U.S. history.
And her response was meticulously documented and analyzed. It's framed not as an admission of guilt, but as a political strategy to deflect blame.
It is. She didn't blame the individuals who committed the crime. She immediately shifted the focus to the government programs themselves.
What was her argument?
Her specific argument, as reported, was that the programs were set up very quickly, often relying on third-party organizations to facilitate aid. And because of this rapid deployment, quote, a lot of the guardrails did not get created.
So in her view, the schemes resulted from fundamental program design flaws.
She was essentially arguing that the government failed to make the theft impossible.
And the analysis we've seen provides a powerful counter-critique to this administrative defense. Why did critics find her blaming of program flaws so disingenuous?
Because it completely minimizes the intentionality and the coordination involved. The analysts quoted in the reports pointed out that she focused entirely on systemic failures rather than the flaws of the people who committed the actual crimes.
Right.
And the reporting emphasizes that nearly 60 people have already been convicted in just the child nutrition scheme alone.
60 people.
60. That level of successful prosecution points not to a few people just stumbling into an open door, but to a highly coordinated, intentional criminal enterprise that was actively seeking to manipulate the system.
The analysts featured in the reports characterized her blaming of systemic design flaws rather than individual criminality as a political defense mechanism. They argue that this focus on institutional failure over personal accountability is a strategy frequently employed by progressive leaders when they're faced with constituent criminality.
And this political analysis extends beyond just Omar herself. The reporting argues that this response is symptomatic of a broader strategy within what they term the modern-day Democrat Party.
And the criticism is what?
The criticism is that rather than holding their community accountable for billions in alleged theft and the associated political corruption, leaders are consistently making excuses and deflecting the blame away from personal responsibility.
The ultimate political conclusion drawn in the reporting is stark. The situation allegedly represents a complete failure of leadership that prioritized political correctness over protecting American citizens and particularly our tax dollars.
And the reports claim that this political failure is what allowed the pervasive system of fraud to escalate to a national crisis level. The analysts suggest that the political pressure to protect and defend the community from external criticism effectively created a permissive environment for the alleged systemic fraud to thrive for years.
And so the federal administration, recognizing this alleged failure, is responding not just with arrests, but with a promise of sustained, heightened accountability.
Right.
The declaration from federal authorities is clear. They are not backing down. The reporting promises more raids, more deportations, and more accountability.
And accountability for both the perpetrators of the fraud and for the politicians who are allegedly enabling this situation. The closing note from the reporting is that the federal push suggests a sustained effort is underway to dismantle the criminal and potentially political structures that allegedly facilitated these systemic problems across the U.S.
A major ongoing policy pivot.
It certainly seems to be. We've covered an immense amount of ground today, tracking the complexity of these twin issues, the mass financial fraud connected to potential international terrorism in the Twin Cities, and the parallel, deeply troubling local political corruption, felony charges, and systemic deception allegations in Maine.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. It's a story spanning the continent, raising critical questions about institutional integrity, the persistence of cultural patterns of exploitation, and the catastrophic failure of political leadership to address these systemic issues when the public trust and taxpayer dollars are at stake.
Thank you. And thank you to our listeners for joining us on this critical deep dive. That's all for this episode of The Deep Dive, but it leaves us with one haunting question. If the guardians of the rules are the first to break them, who is left to protect the game?